Kichi Manitou just means great spirit. And in consistent with indigenous languages, it doesn't say the great spirit. It's interesting to think that in a lot of indigenous languages, verbs far outnumber nouns. And I've come to think that colonizing is nouning, turning things into nouns. And we have to keep things fluid as verbs. But that said, I wanted to make some observations before I go on to the next slide. And that is, unless we know the belief system of people, it's really hard to understand them. And there's a German philosopher who created the word numinous, or the numinous experience. I don't know how many people have heard of it. It's a fascinating concept that talks about the unique confrontation with the power not of this world, the wholly other, the indescribable, terrifying, ranging from sheer demonic dread through awe to sublime majesty. It's an experience that many of us have had in our lives. And to my mind, the religious experience comes from it, and the religious experience of the people, the Weskarinis, indigenous people generally, involves everything. Their whole world was a spiritual reality. Everything was alive. And to understand the Weskarinis or any other part, it's important to understand, in my mind, that aspect of things, that everything is alive and everything is equal and everything has to be respected as equal. There's a tendency for sharing. Intense sharing is the principal ethic of the culture. Sharing, not owning. And that's an important distinction. In times of plenty, sharing. In times of want, sharing. In times of severe deprivation, many indigenous people have demonstrated the ability to starve to death together. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but there you go. Both of those have to be considered. The territory that we're going to look at today, if I can switch the screen, is the Ottawa River Basin. Our rivers in the Laurentians all run down to the Ottawa. And the Weskarinis basically spent their summer on the Ottawa and came back to the Laurentians in the winter and broke up into little hunting and fishing cabins and put away what they needed for the following summer. And the reason they broke into small groups is that they were covering a huge range. And if they were all together, they couldn't cover a huge range. They would be too fixed on the locality where they settled, which means that there might be the territory of, for instance, a weasel is 4 acres. So if you can imagine a moose or a bear, it's huge territories, and you can't all be on the same territory. You'll never see them. The presence of the Weskarini in our territory, and when I say Weskarini, you cannot exclude they're an Algonquian people. That means they speak the Algonquin language, and they're often called Algonquins because they were the first people called something close. When Champlain first met them, the Innu called them the Algonquin, the people who paint themselves red. And Algonquin morphed into Algonquin, but it became also the name for all of the language groups of the Algonquian peoples, which is huge. And we'll talk about that later. But in the Laurentians, you have different areas like Mont Tremblant at the top of the plan, which you can see, where there's the mythology of the trembling mountain, that if the humans upset the natural order, the mountain will tremble. The great Manitou will cause the mountain to tremble. Mont Sauvage is another interesting aspect of the Laurentians, because when the colonists first came and settled in St. Adèle and created the first town above the area that was not townships. Saint-Sever was in that lower area, St. Adèle above. They realized they couldn't go further because there was no river that they could paddle up, and they went everywhere by paddling, just following the Algonquin model. And when they got there, they discovered, to their amazement, that there was a road going around Mont Sauvage, and that there was a whole bunch of people living there. And they said there was only one person living there, but the census has shown just how many there were. And in the early census, all of these people registered as living in Oka. And that's because Oka Gastagi was the only place that they were registered. So if you wanted to send them a letter, you had to send it there. The other aspects of it is La Makaza. Lac des Sables could have come from the word for sandy shore. Arundel, when Albright was doing the survey of Arundel, his team from down in Le Chute abandoned him, and he had to find other people to help him set up, to bring the food, to do all those tasks. And the group of either Weskarinis or another Algonquin group, and you'll understand later why I say or, possibly another Algonquin group, jumped in to help him and to look after him, bringing him food. The only thing they asked was, there was a big area of large fields that they asked him not to survey. It was clear why. You can see this right across Canada in Canadian surveying history. The Indigenous people wanted their places to be excluded from Canada, excluded from the registration as part of Canada. So if not surveying would probably have that effect. If you want to learn more about the Weskarinis and you're comfortable in French, you should look for Jean-Guy Paquin's book, Au Pays des Weskarinis. He talks about the Weskarinis to a much, much later time than I am going to today. So that could be interesting for you. The other place that was very important to them was Lac Nomenang and Petit Lac Nomenang. That area was really their area of security. If they couldn't go to the Ottawa River, they could go to Lac Nomenang. It was a big lake, and that was their center. And the Gardiens du Patrimoine Archéologique, Sylvie Constantin and Sylvain Genereux, two school teachers from up north, spend all of their energy. They created this Gardien du Patrimoine Archéologique, and they find archaeologists to come and work. And they had a show in Kiamika, I guess it was a year or two ago, I can't remember, that we went up to. And that's my phone, so don't worry about it. Sorry, it was answered and gone. We went up to this show, and they showed us a fascinating array of things that had been found in the Nomenang area and other areas. There's even a very interesting find in 16 Island Lake. So everywhere you'll find these things. But up there, the thing that stayed with me as the most fascinating of all was a blue axe head about this long, narrow, shaped about 2 feet, 2.5 feet long. Probably its circumference, it wasn't round, it was a rectangular shape. Would have been maybe 4.5 inches aside, so what would be 18 inches around. And it was shiny, and it was carbon dated to 6,000 years ago.
And it comes up and it says that my internet is unstable.
Sorry, is that a question?
I'm sorry, there are people talking.
Is someone asking a question?
No, they're just talking to each other.
Okay, so shall I continue now?
Yes.
Okay. If you have questions, that's how I heard them, though, and I don't mind being interrupted, so please consider that. Now, if you look here, you'll see the next slide is how they lived. They lived in the winter, they lived in wigwams. And I imagine in other seasons as well, they would have the wigwam, is waterproof. It's made of skins tacked to a wooden frame with a hole in the top to let smoke out, and they would keep a fire going in cold weather inside. And most of their world of mythology happened in the igloo, I imagine. That's where the grandmother. Yes.
Joe, I have a question.
Yes.
What is the difference between a teepee and a wigwam?
We will get there later on. And
Okay.
Bonnie, is Bonnie Shemi present? That doesn't sound like it. But anyway, I'll be showing a book that Bonnie wrote about that very subject.
Okay,
And we'll get there very soon.
thank you.
The imagination I have is a grandmother telling the grandchildren stories. Whiskey Jack, the story of Whiskey Jack is a favorite because Whiskey Jack is a character who was involved in many stories, and one of the things he did was he created the Great Lakes in a sense. He didn't create them, but what happened is he went off hunting the great beaver. This beaver was huge, and he went all the way up to basically the northwestern Ontario, and the beaver got away from him and was leaving that lake. And he followed it down and saw that it broke through each of the lakes and caused them all to join. And he just couldn't catch up with it. He tried and tried. When he finally got to the St. Lawrence River, the beaver had turned itself into Mount Royal and hidden, and so we could never find him. What's fascinating about the story is the Weskarinis who tell that story, and not just them, a lot of Algonquian people tell that story, is the vast area that they knew, the territory that they understood. And we'll get much more in that. But one of the most extraordinary stories, and it's not unique to them, it's more of an Iroquoian story, but everyone would have known, is the story of Sky Woman. And I imagine a number of you know of Sky Woman.
Mm-hmm.
She was the first human on Turtle Island. Was she human? It's a good question because she was almost half supernatural. She fell while digging in her garden because she saw something blue and she had her seed pouch on and she was working. And when she dug out to look what this blue was, it was sky, and she fell in. And she was falling towards Turtle Island when seabirds saw her and flew up to catch her so she wouldn't be hurt, and gently carried her down and asked Grandmother Turtle if she could sit on her back while they figure out what to do. Everyone came to join them, and they talked, and they decided that the best thing to do was to ask her what she needed. And she told them that what she really needed was soil because she had to grow her food. So they all took turns diving to the bottom of the water to try to get some from down there and bring it up. And they all failed until finally the muskrat said she would try. The muskrat was laughed at because she'd never hold her breath long enough. She couldn't do it. She was too small. In any case, she disappeared over the side of the turtle. And the next day they thought she had died. They thought she was gone forever. And when she came back to the surface, climbed up on the back of the turtle and spewed some mud from her mouth onto the back of the turtle. And from that mud, all of the creatures, including Sky Woman, worked together and created the forests, the rivers, and the world that we know on the back of Turtle Island. This, in a sense, the story has two very, very strong messages in it. The one is the contribution of the smallest is essential. And the other is working together, a world can be built. And on the back of a turtle. And these are our fundamental messages of the indigenous mythology, which are ones that we could still learn from today. Just to go through a number of the products that the Weskarinis would have prepared during their winter months and spring months before paddling down and celebrating on the Ottawa River, where they would meet all of the other branches of the families and have all the romantic times, the marriages and everything you can imagine, including the ceremonies of sharing and ceremonies and celebrations. It was syrup products, and syrup products could be carried. They weren't maple syrup as we know it, but they were maple syrup products that could be carried in such a way that they could be chewed or put into things to flavor them and so on. Another thing that they fabricated, manufactured, was clothing and armaments. And you can see in the pictures here, the various, this wasn't their advertising catalog, but it could have been, I suppose. The other major thing that they did was birch bark canoes. We have a small birch bark canoe that was made in Matawan because the Atimatec are also a part of this territory. The Atimatec, where we went to in Matawan, their origins come from Algonquin and Cree, so they speak a language which is slightly different, but a lot of these languages people can understand basic stuff among themselves in. But anyway, the size of a tree that was necessary to make a birch bark canoe, we just don't see them, those size of birch trees anymore. Now a 3-foot canoe they can make. We just don't see those trees. What's happened? I don't know, but that's another question to pose to the environmentalists.
Joe,
John,
I have a question on the feed from someone asking for you to elaborate on the maple syrup products.
Okay, I thought of going back and looking at my notes and being able to tell more about that, but unfortunately I didn't have the time. I'm sorry. I'll have to get back to you on that. So if you send me an email, I think my email is posted somewhere on there.
Your name is Joseph Graham, but you could just maybe give your email and I can send it out.
Okay. Well, yeah, you have it. If you send it out later or whatever, I'd be happy to. I have those notes. I just don't have them in my mind right now. I can sort of remember reading about it, seeing the product in my mind, but as I say, it was something that was put into another material. The sap never got as thick as we do it, but then it could be carried that way.
I'd like to ask a question, John. Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You are addressing me or John?
No, John. You.
Joseph.
Okay, Joe.
Joseph, excuse me. The Manatech and the Weskarinis, the Manatech, were they living together? Were they living close by? What was going on?
The Manatech?
You said the Manatech Indians.
Oh no,
also...
the Timatech. The Timatech are north. They're still there. They're up north. They have huge numbers of reserves, if you want, including Manawan. They're further up north. Your question is very, very good, and the best way I can answer it is to say that it's wrong for us to imagine that the concept of these different peoples is probably largely a European concept, because there was a lot of action and interchange among them all. So yes, they could easily trace back to the same grandparents on both sides. The communities were very mobile, and so it's very possible that well, in the next slide, I'll be dealing with a part of that. So, but before I go there, I just want to mention that all these products that they're making, they would carry them down to the Ottawa, and they would be met there by Iroquoian peoples, principally the Huron-Wendat from Lake Simcoe area, or they would go to Lake Simcoe itself. One of their branches actually spent the winter in Lake Simcoe, and the Mohawk coming up, who had a place further down to the north on the North River. So there were places to exchange. Earlier times, Montreal itself, Hochelaga, was a major place to exchange. And what was exchanged is these gigantic celebrations. These celebrations, no one's done a proper history. I found little inklings of them, but throughout Quebec, there were places of celebration. One was Tadoussac. And these we would call them places of trade, but they would call them places of celebration and ceremony. And to have a really good understanding of that, I would recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I can send this afterwards if I'm reminded. I'll send it out to everybody, or I'll send it to Chloe to share. But Braiding Sweetgrass is an amazingly well-written book by a Potawatomi woman from New England. Now, Potawatomi is actually part of the Algonquian people of Ontario at one point. The Three Fires of the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi were called the Three Fires, or like a confederacy. She describes in Braiding Sweetgrass, she's a botanist, and she describes a lot of the indigenous understanding of growing things and sharing. but principally sharing. It's a marvelous book. So I'll move on from the sharing for now, and the next slide is the first visit of Jacques Cartier. Well, I will deal with Jacques Cartier completely right away because there's much else to get to. Jacques Cartier arrived in 1534, came through between Newfoundland and Labrador, and the first time he saw people was on the Gaspé coast. Before that, fascinating story, he sailed past Prince Edward Island, where he saw a small river, and they dropped a boat to go and explore the river. And way down the river, they saw canoes going by with people in them. And they waved and signaled and shouted, but the canoes kept going by as if there was a big window in between. They couldn't hear each other. They didn't see him. He saw them, but they didn't hear him. And then he went back to the ship, and that was the absolutely first time he saw anybody. But the second time was in the Gaspé, when a group of probably Mi'kmaq, who are also Algonquian people, saw him, and they were so excited that they held up products to offer him, gifts to share. And after working out the nervousness of the two sides, they actually met on a beach, and they did a huge amount of celebrating, in their words, trading in Jacques Cartier's words. By the end of it, they had received a large number of trinkets and fascinating things that they'd never seen before, or may have never seen before, because they could have already traded with the Basque. There's even stories of some of them speaking Basque in those times. But by the time they finished trading, the only thing they had was what they received in trade. All their clothing was gone, and they left happy, singing, naked. A funny little aside, the next people that he met was an Iroquoian people. And this group was the people from Stadacona, and the chief was Donnacona. We get to know a lot more about him, excuse me. We get to know a lot more about him because he stayed with them for a few days, and they traded a lot, and they did a lot of exchanges. They couldn't understand each other. And at the end, when it was time for him to return to France, he began to build a gigantic crucifix, a very, very tall crucifix in which everyone ceremonially stood and prayed. And on the crucifix, it said, Francois, whatever, King of France, claims this territory, basically. And Donnacona understood enough to feel that this was an imposition on the property, on the place. And he came out with a whole group of canoes dressed in a beautiful bear robe, complaining with sign language about the existence of this thing. And Jacques Cartier tried to explain that, oh no, it's just a marker so we can find our way back to meet with you again. But in fact, it was probably not just a marker. But he really glommed onto that bear robe. So he invited them to come into the ship. And when he had received the bear robe in exchange for something that Donnacona was happy to take, and everyone was getting back into their canoes to leave, he grabbed Donnacona's two sons, and left. According to the reports, Donnacona put a brave face on it, and it wouldn't surprise me if he did, because it wasn't abnormal to trade people that way, but there was always the reciprocation of a person from the other people, so that everything would go honorably and the people would be treated well. In this case, it was straight out kidnapping. He promised he would come back in 1 year. Domagaya and Taigogna went with him to France, and they learned to speak French. They weren't impressed with France. They weren't impressed with the poverty, but they learned a lot. And Jacques Cartier respected his promise, and the next year they arrived in Stadacona. It's not Innu Algonquian, it was Iroquois, and we'll get to those distinctions on the next slide. I'm just being told the internet is unstable. Is everything cool?
Okay.
Everything's fine, yeah.
No, your
Okay,
voice
good.
was a little digital there for a little bit, but it's come back.
It's unfortunately the internet.
I probably
taking
just need to
something.
cough.
Okay.
It's fine,
Yes,
Joe.
it's very local. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry I can't mute my mouth when I clear my throat. I'm not driving you guys nuts. Anyway, they arrived at Stadacone, and immediately it was evident that the boys did not want anything further to do with Jacques Cartier. They were home, and that's all they cared about. He had learned so many stories that he wanted to go on from there. He wanted to visit the territory. And in the territory here, you can see, can you see the mouse on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to fix that.
No.
Hang on a second.
Now it's disappeared.
Okay.
That's
Now
my
you can-
Right.
that's
you can
my
see the spot on the
sorry.
screen?
That was my mouse.
Okay, I'm highlighting Weskarinis. Oh,
Um,
it's up in the top, moving around. Okay, if you can't, it doesn't matter.
I
You don't
can
worry
see.
about it.
I
But you can see
can
Weskarinis.
see a little arrow
and you can
above the
see
name.
If I go to, oh, good. It's probably
Cat's
not my mouse.
and Joe's image has disappeared.
That's Montreal.
It's a little white arrow that's off to the left of the picture, or right.
Well, the map just changed, but I don't see any arrow or those.
There it was.
Okay, I see it now. It's on the right hand of the screen. Well,
It's just
gone.
peeking. It's gone again.
Oh, there it is, but it's gone again.
Yeah.
The white arrow on the right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this Chloe's arrow? Oh,
It's
Chloe,
facing
you
all
muted
over.
yourself.
And now Joseph
Chloe,
is
you've muted yourself.
okay.
Oh, there you are.
One moment. I have a phone call.
Oh.
Hello, Ma.
It's page 11.
Oh, corn was a staple.
Hey, Joe, are you there? Can you hear us? I think Joe is lost.
Joe seems to have disappeared.
Yeah.
Okay, let's be patient and study the map.
The other one was much more interesting than this one.
Well, this map is amazing. I'm really starting
Oh,
He's moved on. He's left us behind.
Okay, I guess Chloe and
It works this time. Okay, you can see Hochelaga now, right?
It's working now.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Not that it matters. I think as wonderful as all of this is, we don't really even need to have a slideshow. Just so if it falls to get apart, I'll prioritize Zoom over the slideshow. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, you can
It's
see
actually
the
quite
territory
interesting,
there,
Joe.
and
We
you
can see all the different. Sorry.
different nations, all the different
Yes.
nations.
Yes.
And,
I think
we'll
it's interesting.
now what
That's
what
crazy.
intrigued Jacques Cartier was Hochelaga, but the brothers refused to go with him, so he went down without an interpreter. He witnessed and he documented an enormous settlement, very, very large, and he was welcomed and celebrated and expected to heal the wounded. I mean, heal the people who were ill and so on. He was considered some kind of a miracle, but he didn't stay until nightfall. He was too nervous, so he left again. And but what his real dream was to go to the Huron-Wendat territory that he heard about from these people. It was talked about as being it was an Iroquoian place that was the most cosmopolitan of the Iroquoian places at that time. So it was intriguing. I mean, there were other Iroquoian places south of the lakes, but this one was very, very cosmopolitan. Now, but what I mean by that is they spoke Algonquian languages as well as their own. So, you know, you have to be within reason. But anyway, when he got back to Quebec, to Stadacona, he discovered his people building a fort because the welcome had been exhausted. And he worked very, very hard to reestablish the welcome. And when he did, he learned that there was, Donnacona indicated that there was another chief who may be trying to take his place. At least this is what he interpreted. And it's very, very unlikely that that's what it was. But what happened was that he invited a whole bunch of them to his ship to talk. And the sons wouldn't let the women go. They were nervous, and they were right to be nervous. Some women went anyway. At the end of the talk, Jacques Cartier kidnapped Donnacona and 9 other people and left back for France, completely ruining the French welcome in the Iroquois people of the St. Lawrence River Valley. The things that he missed were the whole maize culture. Maize is corn, and we'll talk more of that too. I just thought it'd be interesting to see the extent of it, because it was the breadbasket of North America. Here are the different nations that were trading around the Great Lake, or celebrating, or however you want to put it. And you can see in the picture, the ones on one line, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Nipissing, Algonquin. The Algonquin comprises the Weskarinis. They traded quite a lot with the Huron-Wendat. And the Tobacco and Neutral and Erie were also Wendat people. The 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee are south of Lake Ontario. The Seneca were the largest group. There was a group further down, which you can see there, called Susquehannock. And the Susquehannock were also Iroquoian. These were all Iroquois, and they were all corn growers and farmers. In the early 1700s, the Tuscarora, whose territory was way further south, you can see it near the bottom of the screen if you look in smaller letters, were taken over by the British, who decided they wanted the territory where the Tuscarora had always lived. And the Tuscarora fought back. So the British brought heavy arms in and began killing them. And they captured a very large number of them to cover their cost. They could sell them for 10 pounds each as slaves once they had defeated the warriors. So the rest of the Tuscarora nation left en masse and joined the 5 nations. And that's why you see Tuscarora with 5 other nations. And that's why we call it today the 6 Nations. When Champlain arrived, this is an interesting time later, because there's no more St. Lawrence Iroquoian that he can find. The Innu don't call it Stadacona, they call it Quebec, which means the narrowing of the river. And they welcome him and they trade with him. And he learns about all kinds of other people, including the Huron-Wendat. He learns about there used to be Iroquois people on the river and on Montreal Island, but they weren't there anymore. Of course, this wasn't true. This was only true to the Innu, who didn't want them to be there, because it was their territory. And what they did for crop rotation, for growing corn, was they would grow the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash intensely for 15 years in the same spot, and then abandon that spot for 75 years. And if you consider the end of one growing cycle to the willingness to start another one, you could have the period of Jacques Cartier's 3rd visit of the 1540s and the arrival of Champlain. In other words, according to a friend of mine from Stadacona, an historian, not from Kanesatake, he says that the knowledge of the Mohawks is that there never wasn't a St. Lawrence Iroquoian people. That's a French perspective. The Iroquoian perspective is that they moved their growing area south. And that makes sense if you look at the Little Ice Age effect and on the effect of the Spanish in the southern states, because the Spanish caused an enormous die-off in the southern states, leaving a vacuum in a territory, and all of the northern people could move south to exploit it because it was empty. And so there would have been a tendency to move south for a short period of time and then move back north. So these factors tend to give much more credibility to the to that story than the French story that they just disappeared. But in any case, Champlain got to explore the neighborhood much more intensely, and he went to he met Huron-Wendat at Stadacona. He promised that he would meet them in 1609 with a bunch of Innu, a bunch of Weskarinis and other people, and they would make a military campaign to go down to Lake Champlain and fight with the Mohawk. And so they organized the campaign, and a huge number of the warriors would go. So the population that went down there was much smaller, and it included Champlain and only 2 other European men with him. And when they got to Lake Champlain, late evening on I can tell you it was it was David's birthday, so I remember it was the 29th of July. They saw another group of canoes. And when the canoes saw each other, both of them withdrew and went to different places on the shore. And they sent emissaries between them. The other canoes were Mohawk. And they made an agreement that it was getting too dark to start a battle, so they would start in the morning when they could see what was going on. And everyone went to sleep and relaxed. The next morning when the battle started, this slide here this is from Champlain's own time. It was colorized, I imagine, since, because most of the stuff is just sketches. And it shows, of course...
Excuse me?
Yes?
Whoever is just, tapping away on porcelain, having a nice meal, could you please put your microphone on mute? It's causing some undue background noise. Thanks.
Okay, is that worked out? Okay, so in this picture, this is not what Champlain reported. There's a lot of inconsistencies in this. One is that he went to meet the Mohawk in the middle of his own allies, where he couldn't be seen, and on a signal, they all ducked down on one knee so that he could fire his gun. At that signal, the other 2 men were in the woods firing their guns. They managed to kill 2 Mohawk chiefs. As you can imagine, the Mohawks left. They had never seen guns. Another inconsistency in the picture is the people are all naked. The Iroquoian people did not go to war naked, but the Algonquian people did. So just a little inconsistencies. Anyway, the next thing he did in 1615 is he went to visit with the Huron-Wendat on their own territory, and there's artists' reconstruction of that. And when he was there, he was invited to fight again. This time was to go down and fight the Onondaga. The interesting takeaway from it is that the Huron-Wendat did not follow his battle orders, so his generaling was a terrible failure. The Onondaga came out of the fort to fight with them, came out from their palisades to fight with them, and it was clear that the Huron-Wendat didn't stand a chance. So Champlain fired his gun, and the Onondaga all ran inside. And one of them climbed up on the palisades and basically said something along the lines of "No fair using guns. That's not how we do it." So you can. The interesting thing about that is that these battles were a certain aspect of them were ceremonial again. How much more were they? Champlain was very impressed with the removal from the battle because he had been injured. He was put in a cage and put on a warrior's back and carried back because of his injury, as were some prisoners and some other injured people. And he said it was a very comfortable ride. I can tell you that the fate of the prisoners should be discussed, which I will do right now instead of later because we're talking about a battle. Among the Iroquoian people, all these people needed genetic exchanges, and genetic exchanges could happen in many ways. But one way that it happened with the Iroquoian people is through prisoners. The prisoner was a warrior, and a warrior from earliest boyhood would be taught his death song. He would have to learn his death song. And it was a song that would give him courage as he was being tortured to death. And the objective for him was to be brave until he was dead, to scare any enemy into understanding that you could not break him. Of course, the rule was probably broken more than respected, in the sense that because people would go delirious and eventually go mad in the torture, the torturing was incredible. They would stop the torture because they had broken, and they would become adopted as to replace a family member who had been lost in a battle. And so there was a genetic exchange. That person would replace a warrior who had died. The family who had received him as a prisoner would adopt him. The genetic exchange methods of Europe and Asia are quite a lot more violent, believe it or not, because they were based simply on rape and imprisoning and subjugating women. You can take your choice. Obviously, none of us can take that choice. The society was built around the three sisters, as I mentioned earlier, and the Jesuits, when they moved in to live with the Huron-Wendat, one of the Jesuits reported that the cornfields were so large that they needed a guide to find their way through them. The women spent their daytime in the cornfields gardening. And it wasn't just corn, it was also, as I say, beans and squash, but sunflower. The men grew tobacco. It was the only thing that they grew, and it was for ceremonial purposes. These massive fields would be abandoned after 15 years, you can imagine. And then there would be the ceremony called the Feast of the Dead, which, if you ever have a chance to come across it, I've put it in my book, so it'll be in my book next year when it comes out. It's an incredible religious experience to read that and to realize what the Jesuits witnessed and perhaps did not properly understand, or clearly did not properly understand. One of the interesting things about this period was that in 1615, when Champlain was with the Huron-Wendat, it was 2 years after the Dutch had started trading with the Mohawk. And we'll have to get back to that because it's a fascinating part of the story.
Joe?
Yes?
Could I just clarify? Obviously, Three Sisters refer to the agricultural products. I understand that it's corn, then you'd mentioned tobacco, and you mentioned two others. Which one are the actual Three Sisters?
The Three Sisters are corn, beans, and squash.
Thank you.
And the reason for it is the corn that we're talking about is maize. It's a grain corn. It would grow very tall and strong, and the beans could climb it.
Ah.
And then the beans would fixate nitrogen in the soil to make the corn stronger. And the squash would protect all of them from weeds and from creatures that would come in because they have prickly leaves.
Thank you.
Uncomfortable stems. So it's a companion planting method, which I use a lot because it's a really, really simple way of starting a garden.
Okay. And tobacco was just an extra.
And tobacco and sunflower and a number of other things were extra. There was melons, there was a lot of things. But we'll get to that too, you'll see.
Thank you.
Anyway, here is the inside, sort of a cross-section of a longhouse. and you can see what it was. Now, the longhouse was sort of a condo. If you can see along the roof line, you can see 3 holes. In this one, maybe only 2. I don't know how well you can see, but those were smoke holes. And a fire would be set on the ground, and each fire was a family. And I asked if Bonnie Shemy was present earlier. If she's there, I'd love to say hi. This is from her book, Homes of Bark. TP.
Hi, I'm here. I'm here. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. Houses of Bark, teepee, wigwam, and longhouse. Don't want to put you on the spot, Bonnie, but if you have any comments to make, I would very much welcome them.
Sure. Okay.
Do you want to comment on this or generally?
Oh, no, they were incredible structures. They were highly flammable. They had to be very careful they didn't light them on fire. And they were smoky. And I've read that they could get eye problems because of the smoke. So they tended to sleep down lower down than high up. But they were incredible structures. And they would be, when they abandoned the cornfields, they would take these apart and reconstruct them in the next area that they're going to live in. And some of them were extraordinarily long. There was one that was really long that they found post holes for that was about as long as a football field. And of course, they were matriarchal. They were run by women, and a man would live with his wife's family. That's how it went. When you got married, you moved into the longhouse of your wife. Go ahead.
Is it a fair statement to say that the longhouse is not uniquely Iroquoian, that you could find it in other parts of North America?
Mm-hmm. I don't really know. It's just that this is the climate for bark, getting bark for, it has to do with the environment and what the materials are available for making these sorts of houses. Because they had, different houses on the prairies and certainly on the West Coast. So I don't know if it's Iroquois, because I don't know what Indian tribes lived in what areas.
Yeah, the reason I ask is, as I heard mention of longhouse on West Coast, the West Coast people. So I assume maybe it was just a similar structure called a longhouse.
Yeah, but it was made out of wood. I don't know how the nomenclature goes, but they call them longhouses as well, of course, yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that extra information, a real bonus. Something I hoped for, but didn't know if you would be here or not.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thanks. I don't know if you can see this next slide is an artist's conception of a game of lacrosse. And in the artist's conception, you can see 2 goalposts. Apparently, in the reality, you wouldn't necessarily have seen them both at the same time. They could have been very far apart. The game was a celebration. It was a contest, and it went on all the time. You would leave it to go sleep, to go eat, and go back into the game, and there was no fixed number of players. So this one looks like there's several different games going on at the same time, and it's very possible. I really don't know, but it's a fascinating way. They even use it for settling tensions between nations. And speaking of tensions between nations, I can go on to the peace chief. The peace chief was chosen by the Society of Elder Women, the Society of Women. And the peace chief was chosen until the women decided that they should call him back. He was generally a man, but not always. And his job was keeping everyone sharing and making sure everyone had what they needed. The shaman or shaman was a different person who would go off into usually the shaman would have some kind of a disability or an illness or a weakness or an incredibly overriding desire to not basically didn't fit in with the general grouping of people. And the shaman would go off into the woods and learn about herbs and medication and this kind of stuff. And the shaman would come back and become a very, very useful attendant to the community. The shaman and the sachem probably are comparable in Hebrew history to the judges and the prophets, in a way, because the prophets were they named themselves, they named their own vocation, whereas the judges were chosen, in that case, by the priests. The Great Law of Peace is something that I'm sure have all heard of. The Great Law of Peace was Dagan Wida was the person who was associated with it, but the other two people that should not be neglected are Jingo Sasha and Hiawatha. Dagan Wida was a Wendat. Jingo Sasha was a neutral Wendat from the very western end, or the further western end. The neutral are thought to be the original first Iroquoian people to come to the Great Lakes, and that all the other nations descended from them. There's no way of knowing if that's true or not. There's thoughts that they came from Teotihuacan in Mexico. It's possible. And I meant to fix this picture because I meant to have, as you can see, that there's 5 symbols. There are a tree in the middle and 4 rectangles, 2 on each side. The middle one is Onondaga. The Seneca jumped on to the next line. The Mohawk and the Seneca are the eastern and western doors. And that wampum that you see there celebrates the 5 nations. It's not exactly a proper representation of the Great Law of Peace, because it's clear that the Great Law of Peace also included the other Iroquoian nations. It was a method of living that when Dagan Wida arrived in Onondaga territory, there was huge fights going on. There was, according to the mythological history, there was cannibalism, there was warlords, it was quite a mess. And Dagan Wida first met Hiawatha, and who lost his family to these wars, and he created a condolence ceremony to help him bury them, to help him move on. And then they worked together to try to stop the wars. He had gone to see Jingo Sasha and said, how can I get your help? And she said, I will help, provided that you acknowledge going forward that the Great Law gives matrilineal descent to the clans, that the women collectively own the agricultural land, and that the women will choose the peace chiefs. These were agreed to, and then Jingo Sasha told the women who built sort of fires with food outside of the villages to make sure the warriors wouldn't come into the villages, and fed them there. That was a tradition apparently from that time. As she fed them, as the women fed these warriors, they also talked with them about Dagan Wida and Hiawatha and Jingo Sasha's plans to create the Great Law of Peace, and that they should join. Eventually, according to the mythology, they all joined, and then they confronted the head of basically the dictator, whose name was Adodaro. And Adodaro was said to wear snake heads on his fingertips and have snakes in his hair, and he was described as the worst and nastiest human being imaginable. And they confronted him and said that they would welcome him as their leader, provided that he respected the Great Law of Peace. And so he did. And what the takeaway for me in there is that this was the beginning, whenever it happened, of a law that lent itself to the American Constitution and many other things, that also started with rehabilitation rather than murder. They didn't take the chief out, have a trial and shoot him or hang him or something like this. They rehabilitated him. Anyway, there's still hope for us. And another very important wampum belt is the Truro wampum, or the Caswentha. This was an agreement established between the Mohawk and the Dutch in 1613. It had an enormous impact on the European development of our area of North America, because the Dutch and the Mohawk agreed to respect each other's territory and rights and culture. The Dutch at that time was the Dutch Republic had just broken away from the Spanish in Europe in the Great Wars of Religion in Europe, and they refused to let religion be the dominant theme of their society. So they were not coming with priests or ministers to convert anybody. They were coming purely for trade, and to my mind, that's a lot of the reason. The reason the Mohawk learned so much about trade before other nations did, because they clearly did. But a side effect of this, one of these unforeseen side effects of the wars of religion in Europe, was that the French had a religious rebellion going on, as well as the German states and a lot of other nations throughout Europe. Half of Europe died in the years of the wars of religion. But they had suppressed their Huguenot Protestants when they assassinated King Henry IV, who was a Huguenot who had converted to Catholicism to try to create peace between the two religions. It was Henry IV who imagined New France. And it was Henry IV who sponsored the group that created the Saint Champlain. The objective was to have a safe area of religious freedom, so that the Huguenots, if things got too hot in France, could always go there. But he was assassinated, and some of the traces of the assassination go back to a man who was called a madman, but he said after he was captured and rapidly executed that the Jesuits told him he would be a hero for doing this. So there's some question about exactly who assassinated him. But in any case, the new king appointed Cardinal Richelieu as his prime minister, and one of his first designations was to make sure that New France would have no Protestant colonists. So the Protestants were not coming, and Champlain had to solve the problem of peopling New France in the traditional French, the traditional Catholic way, which was to convert the people who were already there. And so he brought the Jesuits, and he brought them into the Huron-Wendat territory, and he began trading with them with the understanding that they could only trade with the French if they became Catholic. So some of them became Catholic for the trade, and over time, more and more of them became Catholic. And that took the greatest nation, the greatest cosmopolitan nation of the Iroquoian people, and basically caused some serious rupture in it. I will just go on. And as a result, if you look at the trade routes, excuse me a second, I don't want to make a racket here. Sorry, I just had to clear my throat. If you look at the trade routes, they're all north of the lakes. Those are the French trade routes. They're not, the southern routes would be through Mohawk territory to the other four nations at that time, south of the lake and so on. And there's a lot more to tell, but we don't need to know it all in one day. Anyway, in this map, you can see the black is around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence is the traditional Iroquoian territory. The dotted area is Algonquian, and as you can see, it's immense. It goes from New England to the Maritimes. Well, by the way, there's a very recent study that's demonstrated that the Otek of Newfoundland were in fact Mi'kmaq, had the same blood type. If they weren't pure Mi'kmaq, they were Mi'kmaq related. Excuse me. I'm just going to have some water. In this map, you can see Tehuacan, the place where the corn may have come from with the neutral. It's very hard to know. A friend of mine, again from Kanesatake, Dennis Gaspe, I don't know if he's here today. Dennis, are you here? No, he probably isn't. He's already heard the story anyway. But Dennis told me when I asked him about that, is it possible that the neutral brought corn in the year 500? And he said in his family story, there was a very interesting stone carving that had been passed down for generations, and they believed it came from Teotihuacan. And he could never interest archaeologists or anyone else in it. So he finally used it as his mother's headstone when she passed away, decided to give it a permanent home. He's a mining engineer who spent most of his mining career in Alberta, but now lives in retired back to Kanesatake, the place that he loves. Anyway, you can see the different nations there, and the Iroquois language group and the Algonquian language group is two separate groups. The one thing that I find a little bit confusing for me is to try to see which one is Susquehannock and which one is Tuscarora in the two black ones at the bottom. But in any case, we have a conceit that the Americas were not civilized because they never invented the wheel. This Mayan calendar tends to challenge that assumption. Maybe the wheel wasn't put to the same purpose, but the wheel concept was clearly there, even gears. So you can see that. And the reason to mention the Mayans is that the Mexico was the center, if you want, of the civilization that spanned North America. And when Jacques Cartier talked with Donnacona in Stadacona, Donnacona told him that if he went down south, he would find people who would give him oranges, but be careful because they fought a lot. So you can see that, that Donnacona knew about other people further south. Their knowledge of the areas were very, very broad. They were one civilization. They probably didn't have the internet, but they had other means. In fact, in one of the stories I read in the prairies, during the 1885 uprising, one of the generals discovered that their communications system was slower than the indigenous one over territory, and because the indigenous used smoke signals and mirrors to reflect light and could transmit information very rapidly across the countryside. Let's jump for a second into South America. The Inca was, according to the experts, a separate civilization that grew separately. But the purpose of talking about them is they also had writing, just like the Mayans did. And in fact, just like the Mi'kmaq of Gaspe, apparently had a written language that they wrote on bark when they listened to the priest's lecture. And the distinction was that the written languages were distinct to the families. So they were the family files only. Long lost, no doubt, but interesting background. The Inca had developed a writing system on strings, and the strings were knotted and probably colored. And you could follow your hand down the string to see what it said. The Spanish, these were not very civilized, and so they burnt the libraries. There are some of these strings left, but no one knows how to break the code. We never learned what they say. So we lost the Inca libraries again to the wars of religion because the Spanish wanted everybody to be Catholic. To look for a second at the whole of the Americas, let's quickly go through what they gave us in terms of developing food. And before I do it, I'll start with corn maize. Corn maize was originally developed in the Mexican area. And it is a humanized plant. It cannot reproduce without human intervention. It was originally, its natural ancestor was a few inches tall and had maybe 3 kernels in different locations on it. A totally different plant. I like to imagine, since it was generally women, from what I've learned who did the farming, that these women patiently developed these different different things that we're going to see over a very long period of time. The different ones have gone back thousands of years. And I'll just click through them. I won't read them just to save us time. Can everyone see them? Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Is everything fine over there?
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
good.
you.
Okay, just checking.
Yes, it's working.
Yeah, the potato geneticists have discovered the potato's wild ancestor, something like 10,000 years old. And the wild ancestor was poisonous. It had to be put into lime to suck the poison out of it before you could eat it. So you can see how much was done to develop these things. Zucchini, manioc. Manioc is a staple of Africa. It came from South America. Rubber, a staple export of India, came from South America. They're not indigenous to those places. Even interestingly enough, one of the very first things that was exported from the Americas to Eurasia was the sweet potato, and estimated to have gone to China in about the year 1000. So you can see that the developments are really quite intriguing. For some reason, sweet potato isn't on this list, but that's another story.
Joe, are you saying that cranberry was not native?
No, I'm saying these things were native. These are native things. These were things developed in the Americas. Everything on that screen. They were exported to other places in the world, but they were developed here. Or you could say discovered here. But from what I can tell, most of the fruits and vegetables that we eat in the world were probably developed by indigenous women at some time in different places, including the banana, the orange, and so on. And we have lost that totally in our Eurasian culture.
Joe,
we have
remind us, what's the significance of red, yellow, and blue or turquoise?
May I attribute that to good visibility on the screen?
Okay.
There's no other reason.
Sorry, I was
just
reading.
I put them in different colors.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Okay. Anyway, the list is just about finished, but you can see the enormous number of things that were eaten here and that are eaten now in the world. Imagine the Italians without tomatoes, or the Belgians or Swiss without chocolate. These all came from the Americas. Anyway, the other thing that we can't always appreciate is that all of these, the whole of the Americas were humanized landscapes, something that we just could not appreciate as Europeans when the Europeans first came. The pine forest that ran from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes was maintained. I've come to think of the forests here as the Algonquin forests, because they maintained them. It must have broken their heart when they saw what was happening. Destroyed them. I read the records of one of the surveyors north of Mont-Tremblant. The surveyors kept these records as they did the first surveys. And in his records, he said he couldn't find, he was surveying an area after the big forestry companies had been through and obliterated the forest, taken all the lumber. And so it was basically stumps and fallen branches and this kind of thing that he was surveying. And he said he couldn't find any Indians. What happened to them? Hello. I have a friend in Mont-Laurier who grew up in an Algonquin community. He learned to speak the language. And I said, have you still maintained friendships with the people you grew up with? He said, I'd like to say I have, Joe, but every single one of them that I was close with has died of different diseases. So the diseases have been around for a long time, and they're still there. And I can imagine with the ethics that they grew up with their world vision, that seeing the world they have is heartbreaking for them.
I had somebody
anyway,
Joe? I had somebody raise a hand. Does somebody have a question?
Yes, hello, it's Dwayne speaking. Hi, Joe. I'm using this feature for the first time, so Joe, I have a couple of questions regarding agriculture. Did you say that the sweet potato has been traced to South America, and that it traveled to Africa 1,000 years ago? Did I hear correctly?
Not exactly. It traveled to China in the year 1000.
It traveled to China in the year 1000.
One that went to,
okay, it didn't. But how did it get to China?
Well, probably trade, probably exchange with the Chinese. We make a lot of assumptions that Columbus discovered America, but it's clear that that's not the case. As a matter of fact, I've come to believe that given the culture that we have found in the Americas, that the monumental architecture doesn't fit. It's not something that would be necessarily conceived of by this symbiotic culture that lived with nature. That mass of construction could have been influences from other cultures. So it's just a thought. The other, what went to Africa was manioc, and rubber went to India. You can see them on the screen now. So I went back to that
Yes.
that page. Does that answer?
The other question, very quickly, do you know any? Yes, thank you. Trade. So, but the exact routes may still have to be discovered. The other question simply was, do you know anything about these tree nut forests that apparently there's evidence existed in the Americas long before the arrival of Europeans?
Well, they're on this list, but there was a lot of tree nuts that were considered staples right through this whole area in North America. So, but that's a separate thing. I don't know why I didn't put it on, probably because it's not well known. But I just took this from lists, like there's a book called Indian Givers. You've probably heard of it. Another one, I'll try to get a list of these books. It's a book of indigenous developed or American developed food, if you wish. And there's a lot in there, but I took the things that were familiar to us. There's a lot of them, but there are more. There's lots more. If we can, we will be, you and I exchange from time to time. Try to find those book titles and send them to you. Okay? So, shall I continue?
Joe.
Hello, everybody there?
Joe, could you repeat?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Joe. I wonder if you could repeat the extent of the pine forests that were managed by the natives.
They're from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. Interestingly, the Iroquoian people and probably others burnt the forest floor in areas to bring new growth in, and the new growth would feed the animals like deer and so on. So the other thing it did is the ash, the pine bark was resistant to the fires, so that the pines benefited from these ground fires and grew taller. These were controlled fires that were reported from many different people, including the Dutch. The Dutch description of them, it sounds like the person who was watching a fully grown Dutch man was a child watching in wonder. In any case, so yeah, they were quite large, and they were managed to a large extent. So shall I go on?
Amazing, thank you.
I had one more question.
No, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay.
I had one more question asking what diseases. It wasn't clear.
Well, we're getting there, sadly.
Oh, okay.
We're getting sort of in the denouement of the story now, so we'll be able to have lunch today. Going back north, I described how the trade had broken in two between French and Dutch, and eventually between French and English when the Dutch took over completely from the English. So we've heard of the voyageurs, and here's some of these images from these trade routes come from a wonderful book, which I have listed. I have it right here. It's called funny, when you look for these things, you don't find them. But in any case, I have it listed, and I'll look up the list when we get there. They're really beautiful images of the rivers and traveling. You see the number of people who would be in a canoe in that previous one, and here you see how they could set up a camp with the canoe. Here again, so they could travel for great distances, and the canoe had many more useful usages than just carrying things. And my mouse is. Now, what they did in all of this traveling around is they brought disease. Now, why they brought disease is an interesting question. You can see them listed, some of the types of diseases. There was more, but the Jesuits also brought them into the Huron-Wendat territory. So the Huron-Wendat cynicism of the Jesuits grew as the disease grew, but it didn't help because by 1634 the disease had hit, and the Huron-Wendat lost 50% of their people. Now, Europe and Asia have the influence of herding cultures. A herding culture is one that has herds like sheep or goats or cows and so on. And humans living together with their herd animals would exchange diseases with them. And there would be die-off, but the die-off happened over a very, very long period of time. All that contagion was still in the humans who came from Europe. They brought these diseases with them because of that. These people did not herd. The only herding that in the Americas was a little bit with the llamas. And if you look at the culture, you can understand why they didn't herd, because the Algonquin people, particularly, is the easiest one to describe because that's what we're talking about, believed themselves to be the youngest sibling in a hierarchy of a family. The people, the Anishinaabe means the people, were the youngest sibling in this hierarchy. And all the other ones they could learn from, but they also had to care for them. And learning from them and caring for them and sharing with them meant that they had to respect their territory. They ate them. Like I was describing, I don't know what happened to it, a slide that I thought was in here of hunting beaver in a beaver hutch. They would stick their spears into the beaver hutch, and the beaver would send out little ones who would be taken and eaten, but the rest would be left. So in this method, the beaver and the humans had an understanding. But when they did anything like that, there was a huge amount of forgiveness asked, an appreciation, literally, tobacco was used as ceremonial things. They would put tobacco as a thank you for giving the life of. But as a result, they maintained herds. Like they probably could tell you exactly how many deer there were in the territory, how many moose there were. They knew. And a book that can enlighten you a lot on that subject is the Barrier Lake Algonquin. It's a very recent book, and it describes what's wrong with the situation, because these people, after 1990 and the Mohawk uprising in Kanesatake, where they defended their territory, these people a year later wanted recognition for their territory. This is a bit northwest of, or probably even due west of Maniwaki. And what they did is they had huge territory they hunted in. They had no control over it. And so they said that they would control over it, and they would decide where the miners could go and where the foresters could go. And the Quebec and Ottawa governments accepted it. I guess they didn't want another problem like Oka. And then they spent about the rest of the decade taking that back from them. In the early 2000s and something, they literally created a coup d'etat among these people to take back the rights that they had given up. They discovered in that time that the companies were happier to deal with the local people and understand where they could and could not go. It actually worked. But the problem was it set up a political precedent of a part of the countryside that was no longer a part of Canada in any practical way. They did their own taxing, their own income, and so on. That wasn't something that the Canadian or the Quebec governments wanted tolerated. But anyway, to get back to the diseases, all of the Iroquois nations were seriously weakened by the smallpox, the measles, all these different, often childhood diseases, and as a result, the Huron-Wendat began to break between the traditional people and the Catholics. It divided in two. The largest Iroquois place divided in two. It was on the verge of a civil war, if you wish, something that was totally foreign to them. Some of the traditional people had left. They had gone to the Seneca and so on. So the Five Nations knew about these problems. And remember, by this point, the Tuscarora hasn't joined yet, so it's still the Five Nations. And they're listed on the map, if you can read that. The French saw what the Five Nations had done south of the lakes in setting up a trade group that dealt with the English and the Dutch as one unit. And all trade went through them. And they didn't like that because these people were not Catholic and could not become Catholic because they didn't need to. So when the Mohawk sent emissaries to the Huron-Wendat to join in the trade bloc, and so they all worked together, all of the Iroquois people would work together and buy and sell, if you wish, together with the Europeans. The French severely undermined the desire and set the two against each other because they would lose all the Catholics. They would lose, these people wouldn't need to be Catholic anymore, and they wouldn't need to be to deal with the French. They could deal with the French or the English. So there was a major division, and the French actually met with the Five Nations in conference to try to solve the problem, but they didn't understand the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that if you're dealing with the French, you cannot deal with the English or the Dutch. And therefore, they were trying to create their own market bloc from the other side of the table. This was going to come to no happy end, and it didn't. What happened is the Five Nations, heavily armed because the Dutch and the English did not mind selling guns, the French didn't like selling guns, came into the Huron Confederacy that was already weakened by the disease and the division between the traditionalists and the Catholics. And they destroyed Huronia. Interestingly, in the history books, we're told that they were, a mean people, ruthless fighters who destroyed Huronia. In fact, after the battle, after the wars, there was more. The population of the Seneca, for instance, more than doubled. It was already the largest nation. All of the nations benefited from the adopted warriors that were adopted in their traditional sense and much more rapidly brought into the community than they were in normal times because they needed people. And with the need of people, the Huron Confederacy still doesn't exist, but the Hurons still do. Some of the Catholics to Quebec and they created Wendake. Some went south and joined other nations. Some went north. They went in many different directions. And you have the Wyandot in the United States. So this huge culture still is with us, but the principal Iroquoian culture is the Five Nations today. After they had finished with the Huron-Wendat, they wanted to eliminate France's trading partners. They wanted to isolate France and make it so that France had to trade with their bloc. And part of that was the Weskarinis. And they went up the Rouge River all the way to Lac-Nominang, to Petit Lac-Nominang, where there was a major battle which the survivors, the Weskarini could not possibly have won. They were outgunned and outnumbered. When I wanted to publish Naming of the Laurentians, I was trying to do the backup information on that battle, which I learned about from Histoire des Laurentides by Serge Laurent. And I wanted to find an indigenous confirmation. And I kept contacting people in Maniwaki, different places like this. I could not get anyone who could share the story with me. I understand much better now, because the more I study the indigenous people, the more confused I am in a lot of ways, because it's such a vast story, and it's hard sometimes to understand what the real important parts of it are. But in any case, I had to publish based on Serge Laurent's suggestion that the Mohawk eradicated the Weskarinis and there was no more indigenous people in the Laurentians. Well, once I published, did I get my knuckles wrapped? I started hearing from Weskarinis, which is wonderful. They were surprised when I was so delighted to hear from them. It was a revelation to me that if you can't find a fact and you want to find the truth, publish. Someone will come up and give you an option. After that battle, sorry, is there a question? No, okay. After that battle, roughly 1650, the territory of the Laurentians, the Iroquois, the Five Nations could claim by European right of conquest. But in fact, the Weskarini, the Kichesparini, the Nipissing, all these people that they tried to eliminate just went further into the north and then came back afterwards in reduced numbers, but they came back and different concentrations. In the meantime, the Five Nations was still trying to set up its trading bloc. And the trading bloc had been based on the covenant with the Dutch, which they called the Turo Wampum. But now they enlarged it to be called the covenant chain. And the covenant chain allowed them to bring links into the chain of non-Iroquoian people to join it, and to bring links of European people who were not necessarily the English, because this treaty was principally with the English. And so they created this covenant chain that the French did not join, and that the Ottawa and the other nations that had been allies of the French did not join. So the battles kept going with the French for quite some time afterwards, until 1701 at the Le Grand Paix in Montreal, in which the Canadiens were basically accepted as a nation by the indigenous nations, and the French accepted they didn't accept the covenant chain per se, but they accepted that they would not make war on each other anymore. But their signatories were of all these different nations to try to stop the wars. We can now get in our canoe and head back up into the Laurentians and back towards Lake Nominee. But just before finishing, I think I wrote it in here to remind me, and I forgot. The Wet'suwet'en traditional chiefs have come to an understanding with the Canadian government. The Wet'suwet'en joined the Five Nations in a treaty very recently, in which the Five Nations committed themselves to helping the Wet'suwet'en stand up to Canada. And so the Five Nations, when they did the railroad blockade just before this COVID-19 story took over everything, the Canadian government received a message saying, a traditional saying was, the covenant chain has been tarnished and we have to get together and shine it again to polish the covenant chain. The covenant chain has been tarnished means that one side wasn't respecting it. The covenant chain still exists in law. And the proclamation of 1763 was to confirm an updated Turo Wampum and the covenant chain with the British after the 7 Years' War. And so they're bringing the covenant chain back in as a legal document. And it has, they met with the Minister of Indian Affairs, who in fact speaks Iroquoian. And they established an understanding with the traditional chiefs based on these meetings. and the barriers were taken down in Kanastaki and Kanawaki. They were already taken down in Ontario by the police. But the Five Nations had to make it clear that they would not stop. There would be trouble unless they respected it. And what we're going to see in our future is the covenant chain coming back into normal parlance. And it's a wonderful development, if you ask me, because it means that we have a future that we will be able to understand and share in more Indigenous terms. Anyway, we're back in Lake Nominang. The story is over, and I really thank you for your time listening. The story, as I said, would end in the 1650s, and a bit beyond that, but here we are. Thanks very much. And here's the different sources, as well as the books reviewed, and I can go more slowly if anyone wants me to. And I please ask you, since we all remember that Four Corners is the initiator of this, that we can all do what we can to support Four Corners, which looks after the English-speaking population in the Laurentians, providing health and social services. Chloe is the organizer, and I thank her very much for putting this together.
I thank you for the presentation.
It's
So-
lovely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Thanks.
Yeah, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or you can use my email and we can do it that way.
Thank you, Joe.
Oh, it's 20 to 12.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks very much to all of you for being here.
Very informative.
Yeah, it was wonderful to have this experimental way of breaking the lockup, the isolation. Thanks very much.
Have to do this again.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Chloe.
Thank you, Joe and Chloe.
Merci, Joe.
Okay, so I'll end the show and just go back to Zoom.
Well, this was a show.
This was a show, wasn't it?
Dance for us now.
Can you put the book
And we
back
did it
on
before the bandwidth died. It usually dies around noon.
Yeah, we're lucky today.
Yeah, we were very lucky because the other day it didn't work that well.
Joe, can you put the book back on